my view is that the privacy of patients accessing legally agreed medical care, in particular that which relates to some of the most fundamental questions that a person can face, which is, am I going to have this baby now? That's an incredibly deep question for an individual to face, and I don't think that anybody else outside of that person and the relationships that they have with the people immediately involved actually has any kind of close right to interfere.
Pro-lifers for many years have had a good practice of offering charitable leaflets about support services available to women who might like to consider continuing their pregnancy if they know about other options available of economic support, of spiritual, emotional advice, etc.
I have come to accept the need for these very, very minimal exclusion zones around clinics, because abortion clinics in Britain are peculiarly exposed.
Unfortunately, where we've seen buffer zones come in already under local authority measures, we've seen people arrested or fined even for the thoughts they've had in their head. No matter what your opinion is on abortion, we should all be able to agree that free speech is paramount, freedom of thought is paramount, and these laws go far too far.
Hello and welcome to Unbelievable, the show that gets Christians and non-Christians engaging in some of life's biggest questions and at times profound moral dilemmas. I'm your host, Andy Kind. Today we are touching on a sensitive and deeply complex subject that affects both men and women alike, that of abortion. Specifically, we'll be discussing buffer zones outside abortion clinics, which have sparked intense debate around the world, including in the UK, where new legislation comes into force on the 31st of October this year, 2024. These zones would make it illegal to influence someone's decision to access abortion services, including activities like prayer within a 150-metre radius of clinics. This conversation resonates not only in the UK, but also in the US, where similar debates have unfolded, particularly around silent prayer at abortion clinics in cases like McCullen versus Coakley in 2014. These issues raise challenging questions about balancing public safety with individual freedoms of speech and religious expression. Well, we are grateful to have two thoughtful guests who have wrestled extensively with these matters. Jan McVarish, a pro-choice advocate supporting buffer zones, and Lois McClatchy Miller, a pro-life defender and senior legal communications officer for ADF, who advocates for religious freedom and free speech, particularly in cases like silent prayer outside clinics. Thank you to both of you for joining us for what we're sure will be a meaningful discussion on this important but tough topic. So welcome both.
Thanks, Andy.
Let's dive straight in. We will circle back for a bit of origin story from both of you, but we want to dive straight in. Now, Jan, supporters of buffer zones argue that they protect the privacy and safety of women accessing clinics, but Lois, you would argue that they infringe on fundamental rights such as freedom of speech and religious expression. Could you both explain initially why you think the law should or shouldn't prioritise public safety over free speech in this context? Jan is obviously the first timer, so we'll give you a chance to settle in and enjoy the hospitality. Lois, you are a familiar face to Unbelievable viewers, so would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Well, to me, buffer zones is the most censorial act of the British government in the last 20, 30 years. I've been really appalled to see these zones come in. They are large areas of public space covering several streets where nobody is going to be allowed to engage in influence influence a woman's decision to access an abortion facility. Now that law, that wording is incredibly broad. So let's talk about what we're not speaking about. Obviously, harassment is wrong and is already illegal, and nobody should be supporting harassment of any woman anywhere, let alone outside a clinic. But what influence can refer to, because this wording is so broad and so vague, is that it can mean really anything that the good authorities decide it to mean. Could it be that a mother who says to her daughter, "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Is that influencing her decision? Can we say that every woman approaching the clinic has even made a decision? Is it not her right to be able to discuss that, to discuss options available to her? Because pro-lifers for many years have had a good practice of offering charitable leaflets about support services available to women who might like to consider continuing their pregnancy if they know about other options available of economic support, of spiritual, emotional advice, etc. And so I'm defending that free speech for those women who want to have those conversations, for those volunteers who've done a great job at pointing to resources available. And because it isn't up to authorities to say what someone can be thinking, saying, expressing outside the clinic, unfortunately, where we've seen buffer zones come in already under local authority measures, we've seen people arrested or fined even for the thoughts they've had in their head in these buffer zones. That's how far reaching this legislation can be. And I think no matter what your opinion is on abortion, we should all be able to agree that free speech is paramount, freedom of thought is paramount, and these laws go far too far.
Thanks, Lois. Jan, how would you like to kick us off with your opening statement?
Yeah, well, I'm a free speech advocate. That's what I do as my job. I work for the Free Speech Union, but I'm talking here in my individual capacity. And I would say I'm somebody who's thought about this for a really long time. So I've thought about the abortion question for a very long time. And then when buffer zones were being mooted, I also thought about that. And I changed my mind on them. I was originally sort of less able, I would say, to balance out the free speech argument with actually one that has equal weight in my mind. And the one that has equal weight is the full consideration of the privacy of women or the people accessing clinics, and that is women. So that I don't make a particular moral case because they're women, but I make a particular moral case because they are patients. And my view is that the privacy of patients accessing legally agreed medical care, in particular that which relates to some of the most fundamental questions that a person can face, which is, am I going to have this baby now? That's an incredibly deep question for an individual to face. And I don't think that anybody else outside of that person and the relationships that they have with the people immediately involved actually has any kind of close right to interfere at the point where the woman is actually accessing the care. And that's my line. So I have no problem with pro-life arguments, anti-abortion arguments being made anywhere else. I don't have a problem with protests about it anywhere else, but I have come to accept the need for these very, very minimal exclusion zones around clinics, because abortion clinics in Britain are peculiarly exposed compared to other types of medical provision. They're often not within hospitals. That's partly because the NHS has sort of outsourced abortion care to private providers. There's a kind of peculiarity to it in that, and in that sense, women's privacy is even more exposed because they're not just, anybody going into a hospital, you don't know why they're going. If women are accessing an abortion clinic, chances are, it may not be that it's an abortion clinic every day of the week. It could be that on Tuesdays it's something else, Wednesdays and Thursdays it provides abortions. But that woman is very exposed as somebody who is at that point seeking either a consultation about an abortion or actually abortion treatment. And I think that exposes her to an unacceptable degree if other people who are intent on identifying her as somebody seeking an abortion are free to access her on their own terms. I think there's a very strong case for protecting women's privacy. And I think we should remember where these came from. These came about because there were really very unacceptable, I think, protests taking place outside abortion clinics. I was looking at pictures today from a clinic in Blackfriars in London, where protesters were standing right up outside the railings of a clinic with huge metre-high pictures of dismembered fetuses, babies, if you want to call them that, and I don't have a problem with calling them babies. But they were doing that a metre from the doorway of a clinic. Now, I haven't heard pro-life people who are talking about buffer zones actively condemning that kind of action. And then the reason why those people were pushed back and have ceased to take on for now those kinds of activities is because there was a threat of buffer zones and there was legal action threatened against them. And now new tactics have been adopted. And in some ways, this is a reversion to old tactics of pro-life people, which was to stand outside clinics and pray. And that went on for years. People who ran abortion clinics said, look, we've just tolerated that. That's not something we thought that we should take legal action against, because we accept their freedom of conscience and we also accept that of ours as clinic staff and that of our patients. But it was when the activities stepped up that action around buffer zones was then proposed, and also obviously looking to the states where far more aggressive action was being taken. So I think it's, we need to bear in mind that that's where this comes from. That's where these proposals come from. They don't just come from some, very well-meaning people just standing in ones and twos outside clinics praying. If that was all that had ever happened, I don't think this would have come about. It's because there was a stepping up of tactics by the pro-life movement.
Thanks so much, Jan, for that very well-spoken opening statement. Lois, interestingly, though, the stuff going on in courts at the moment is precisely around people in ones and twos praying silently. There's a case which is going to be answered next week. A couple of recent cases, though, where people have been arrested for praying silently and have ultimately been found innocent because, well, what is there to prove? So you would presumably want to say that the problem here is that we have disproportionate law enforcement in a situation like this, would you? And in saying that, do you want to give a couple of the examples of the cases that have been ultimately thrown out?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the government did a review, the Home Office had a review in 2017 as to what was really going on outside abortion clinics, because this was when buffer zones started to be discussed. And the Home Office found in that review that instances of harassment were very rare. And I quote that to say that they were rare. And the majority of activity was that people were standing praying in ones and twos, typically older women who wanted to give their charitable time to supporting younger women. We know from campaign groups like Be Here For Me that a lot of these volunteers have been in the shoes of women going to abortion clinics themselves and have themselves received help, and then want to, when they have found their feet, when they have come to a position in life where they're able to help, have then gone out as volunteers. Alina Delgariu is one of the examples of that. She was a very prominent voice trying to keep those options of help open to women. So we do know that this is the majority of activity that is happening, and that is absolutely legal, lawful, and helpful, and should never be criminalized. We did see the most iconic case, Andy, was Isabel von Spruce, 2 years ago now, was seen in a viral video being arrested for standing outside an abortion facility. She was alone, or it was a friend that stayed in his car nearby in case she ever requires some help. But she stood individually and imperceptibly prayed in her head. She didn't engage with anyone. She didn't take any risks, as it were, to violate a PSPO or buffer zone order. She thought, the least I can do is just stop and pray for these women, for these families who are facing this difficult decision today. And police approached. You can see the video. They asked what she's doing. She said, I might be praying in my head. And that was enough to trigger an arrest, enough to trigger a trial. And yes, of course, with ADF International's support behind her, she was found innocent, because praying silently in one's head cannot be a crime. It cannot. We don't have thought police today in 2024. That's vanished to the pages of 1984. However, as the timeline has progressed, as this new law has come into effect, we've seen more individuals face court because of the same activity of simply stopping to pray, even for a few minutes within a buffer zone, even out of line of sight of the clinic, even not stood right outside, but across a road, down a street. We've got Adam Smith Connor. I attended his trial just a few weeks ago in Bournemouth. He was an army veteran and a father of two. He had been involved in performing abortions as part of his medical training many years ago, and he actually had facilitated the abortion of his own child and many years ago as well. He's now had a change of conscience about this. Is something that's very close to his heart, and he stopped just for a few minutes to pray near an abortion facility in Bournemouth, and that has led to 3 days of trial for 3 minutes of prayer. Now, this in this country right now, for us to be spending this time and resources on prosecuting people for their silent thoughts is an incredible misuse of public funds. There was almost £100,000 of local council money, taxpayers' money, spent on prosecuting Adam Smith Connor. It's absolutely outrageous that this should happen in the UK today. And it shows that there is a targeting of pro-life thought, of Christian thought and speech, which is perfectly lawful, perfectly peaceful, and should not put someone behind bars or subject to a fine.
Thanks, Lois. Jan, how would you like to come back on that? Anything that you want to pick up from what Lois has said?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key issue here is location. That's all it matters. That's why I don't think this is a speech issue. This is why it kind of untroubles me as a speech issue, which obviously I take speech issues really, really seriously, and I think long and hard about these things. I think if I were to go and stand outside a clinic thinking about the politics of abortion, but stationing myself opposite the entrance within a buffer zone, I think I would have to accept that I might get arrested for my thoughts, which might well be, emanating support for women seeking abortion, whichever decision they make when they actually get inside the clinic. Now, the law doesn't specify that it's pro-life ideas that are against the law. So I think that this tactic, and it is a tactic, I've been an activist all my life. I've undertaken protests. I've been arrested for protests. I understand what tactics are. I think the sort of silent prayer motif is the tactic that's being used by the pro-life movement to try to move the terrain of the abortion argument onto a free speech terrain. So over the years, I've tracked the pro-life arguments, and they've moved from a moral religious argument because they realise that actually they're no longer going to win over a majority of people on those grounds because we have a secular society by and large. That's not to say that those arguments are not valid and worth everybody considering, and I certainly do myself, but nevertheless, they're not the ones that are most persuasive to people nowadays. When that was realised, the pro-life arguments moved on to a different terrain, which was about physical health. So then we had health scares about cancer being caused by abortion, or other kinds of ailments being related, or infertility being related to abortion, all of which were proved to be wrong. But nevertheless were kind of a stage in the development of the pro-life arguments in recent decades. And then they moved on to mental health. So then we had arguments around trauma, post-abortion syndrome, and this kind of another set of sort of scaring tactics, I think. And then now we have a migration onto another terrain, which is of free speech, because they understand that there is purchase amongst a lot of people for to defend free speech, thank goodness, because I do think it's really serious. But I actually think this is quite a cynical tactic. I don't think that the pro-life movement is cynical in its belief that abortion is wrong. I absolutely accept that they think it's wrong. But the fact is they live in a society with lots of people who either don't think it's wrong or don't think it's as wrong as the pro-life people do. So therefore, they're able to make much more pragmatic decisions about pregnancies that they face. And so I think that the pro-life movement would be far better to direct its attention to all the other areas of life where they could make their arguments and make their case and provide their evidence, and also talk to and support people other than the 150 metres outside of an abortion clinic. So that's why I don't think it's a speech issue. And I really think the silent prayer motif, whenever I've had conversation with people about this, who, when they see it on social media, think, I can't believe we live in a country where silent prayer is banned. Once you actually talk it through, they go, oh, well, actually, yeah, okay, that's not quite what's going on here. So those individuals that Lois mentions, they didn't stumble into the area. They chose to go and breach the exclusion order. And they did that so knowingly, which I don't condemn, because I think that's up to you. If you want to accept the risk of arrest by making a protest, that's the nature of things. I've done that myself. But I don't think it's then right to sort of claim this is the greatest injustice going when it's clearly a tactic of raising awareness about the issue they care about. And I do object to the idea that somehow this is about a banning of silent prayer, and not least because in other areas of life, I completely agree that pro-life arguments are being monstered and pro-life arguments are being chased off university campuses, which I'm very, very concerned about. Or if somebody were to articulate them on a TV program or something, they might be they might be then condemned. And I or in the workplace, if where appropriate, I do think all that's really worrying and wrong. But I think that this is really a question of place.
Yeah, maybe I can just push back a little on your framing there, Jan, only because I picked up on you saying that you have experience as a protester, and you absolutely do. And I wonder, though, if you have, and you framed it as a protest point, but I don't know if you have experience as a Christian. And therefore, I don't know if you know the validity and the sincerity with which people pray. Because if you're not a Christian, and from the outside you may say, oh, well, they're just standing there saying they're praying to make a political point. But I know Isabel, I know Adam, I know those who go outside clinics, and they go there because they want to pray for the individuals who are being hurt by abortion. And there's a lot of validity to these they're not tactics to say that abortion has a poor mental health outcome. In fact, the best known scholar on abortion and mental health is David Ferguson. He died recently. He was an Australian guy. He was a pro-choice person of pro-choice beliefs, but he uncovered some of the greatest impacts of abortion on mental health, how it can increase risks of anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and more by over 100% in many cases. And so if we see this as a pro-life movement just being strategic, and trust me, I wish the pro-life movement was more strategic than it is a lot of the time, but if you see it as tactics, then I don't think you fully grasp what is going on, why they're there, and what they're expressing in their head, and therefore why it is such an injustice that any police officer would tell them, you cannot think that, you cannot pray that, when of course they can pray that.
There. You're missing out the there. It's not okay. You cannot say that or think that, it's there.
So with the location argument, I do wonder, though, if this sets a precedent. And it is easy, I think, if you're not pro-life, I understand kind of how it would be easy to say, well, this is appropriate in that location. But the precedent of saying a government can define an area of public land where where you cannot express an opinion that they don't like, where is that to stop? Could we face a situation in a few years where a buffer zone is going to be put around a gender clinic because they don't want any parents influencing or partners influencing a decision of someone to access gender affirming care or something that they would appreciate, that they would be on offer in that clinic? Could we find ourselves having buffer zones around town halls because conferences might take place and people with other points of view on gender or marriage or sexuality or any political topic of the day, they would be silenced there because it might offend or it might upset somebody within the town hall? Where do we stop letting the government have authority over opinions in the public space? I think that's a big problem for me. I try to, if I step out of being a pro-life person and just think about being a free speech person, I think allowing authorities to define public areas where certain opinions are not welcome is a big problem, fundamentally, when we look at the free speech landscape in the UK today.
Right, well, that sets us up very nicely for the second part of the show. The first part has absolutely flown by, both Jan and Lois expounding their views very clearly, very even-headedly and even-handedly. And so lots to look forward to, if that's the right term, in the second part of the show. You are watching and listening to Unbelievable with me, your host, Andy Kind, and my guests today are Lois McClatchy-Miller and Jan McVarish. We're talking about freedom of speech. We're talking about buffer zones outside abortion clinics, and I'm sure we're going to get on to the moral worldviews underpinning those. But it's been a very substantive conversation so far, and so do stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment. Of course, you can email us at any point, unbelievable@premier.org.uk. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. How very modern of me. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please give us a follow. But we'll be back in just a moment.
Looking at the gap between what I was experiencing during frontline work and what I had been taught as feminist theory shook my faith in feminist theory. We seem to have just abandoned any effort to control men and to constrain male sexuality, which has to be constrained.
As you say so powerfully in this book, the whole sexual revolution has been a boon for caddish men. It's justified by contemporary liberal feminists as being something beneficial for women, but in fact those who have benefited the most are the ones who have the most contempt for women.
Yeah.
Welcome back to Unbelievable with me, your host, Andy Kind. And today we're talking about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and buffer zones outside abortion clinics. This is Unbelievable. We'd love to hear from you. So email us, unbelievable@premier.org.uk, and you can find details on our website, premierunbelievable.com. Well, my guests today are Jan McVarish and Lois McClatchy Miller. Had a very good conversation in the first section. We're going to dive straight back into it. So, Jan, for the benefit of the viewers, it seems to me that you're although you are a pro-choicer, you're not against pro-life arguments at all. You're simply trying to say here that it's about location, that there is a point at which people should not be harassed or made to feel unsafe or unsure about the decision they've made, in the same way that with all your good intentions, you wouldn't race into an operating theatre and start singing songs. Whereas Lois is worrying about the fact that this seems to be a bit of a sprat to catch a mackerel, and what will we see? Are we going to start to see buffer zones outside town halls or badminton courts or whatever? So, Jan, do you want to pick up on where we left off and respond to what Lois was saying?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we always should consider this question of precedents and slippery slopes, if you like. And I think that I would only accept these kinds of restrictions in a very, very limited way. But I think in my head, I'm very clear as to why the argument is justified when it comes to clinics. And as I said earlier, it is about the exposure and the potential identification of those particular patients, because it's very clear what they're accessing. And I do think that is, I can understand the strong feelings of somebody who wishes to devote themselves to the cause of opposing abortion. I understand that. I also think I appreciate what prayer might be. I mean, I was raised as a Christian. I departed from it, but that isn't why I'm pro-choice or anti-abortion, opposed to the anti-abortion lobby. It's not because of faith. It's because I don't think that the pro-life lobby has a monopoly on ethics or on conscience. So I actually think the conscience of the women accessing clinics matters more than the conscience of one woman who decides to pray outside, because she can do that anywhere, whereas the woman accessing the abortion has to go there. That's the only place she can go. So, and then to move on to the question of which maybe clarifies the kind of precedent slippery slope argument. The difference between a town hall and an abortion clinic is that an abortion clinic is the only place a woman can go to access an abortion. It's not a political space. I would argue, although there's a pavement outside of it, it's not a public space. The clinic itself is private. And not only that, it's where privacy is elevated above any other area of life, really. Privacy when it comes to medical care is incredibly important. We don't let people see people's medical records. People have the right to privacy in this most intimate area of life, and it's the most intimate area of medicine, I would say, because it is so, it's a morally divisive issue, and it's also something that's so intimate to the woman making the decision. It's about her most intimate parts of her body. It's about her future projections of what family life will be. And so I think that's very, very different to whatever might go on in town hall, whether that's a discussion about abortion or anything else. Anywhere else, knock yourself out, display your posters with some provisos. I mean, hopefully people wouldn't want to show posters of dismembered fetuses outside schools, for example. I do think there's limits on these things. It's not a free-for-all. But I also think, to sort of pick up on Lois's examples, I can sort of see an instance where, for example, much as I'm opposed to gender affirming care of allegedly trans children, it's an issue that I'm active in. I care a lot about that issue. I don't think outside clinics necessarily where children are accessing care is the place to protest or to do anything, actually. I mean, I can see situations where maybe it may be legitimate, but even then I can't see why you can't just go 100 metres down the road and still you've got greater access to the public rather than to patients. And similarly, so when the euthanasia question, or assisted dying, as the euphemism is used, is coming up, are we then to tolerate protests outside hospices in order to not even, prior to end of life care ending in the ending of lives, should we therefore try to lobby patients in hospices? I think that would be, it's intolerable. It's undignified. It's a massive intrusion. Even though the patient themselves will be inside the hospice and won't even know. It's the families coming and going. It's the staff who are undertaking these deep moral questions all the time. As I say, I don't think the pro-life lobby can claim to have a monopoly on conscience or on ethics.
Lois, I'm sure you have a response teed up.
Yeah, well, I just wondered, Jan, if you had thoughts about the vagueness of the law itself, because obviously you're focusing mainly on protesters, but the law bans influence. It doesn't mention protesters, about influence of anyone accessing or making or influencing anyone's decision to access an abortion facility. Now, when you think about the kind of person who might accompany someone to an abortion clinic, whether that's a friend, a parent, a partner, technically all of these people are also going to be forbidden from any form of influence, whether that's a question like, are you sure that you want to think about this for a bit longer? And I can imagine that rolling out in a euthanasia scenario and a gender scenario, to a parent saying to their son, to their daughter, I love you the way that you are. Your body is made the way that it should be, and you're perfect. And I don't think you should change. Are you sure you don't want to think about this a little bit longer? Now, that is an act of kindness. It's a very legal, is much within a parent's rights to be able to say that to their child, or a partner to ask their partner if they are absolutely certain if they want to go through with this, if there's anything they can do to help them come to a different decision. I think those are very legitimate conversations to have. And although the media concentration on buffer zones has focused on the raving lunatic protester, the majority of conversations that we're having out there aren't about that. They're either with family members or with charitable volunteers who might not even approach, but simply be there so that if anyone wants to come and talk to them, if those women who would like to exercise their right to speak freely, to have free conversations, wants to approach them and have a conversation, they're able. We know, and in this case of Livia Tisici-Bolt, she held a sign saying, here to talk if you want, in order that she would only be discussing with people who wanted to have that conversation. She didn't approach anybody. And yet she received a fine for being inside a buffer zone. So do you agree perhaps that the law, the way it's worded, is much too vague and targets those that shouldn't be targeted?
I think from looking at the law, I think it's probably vague in order to be even-handed. So I think the intention, I know it doesn't seem that to you necessarily, but I think because it doesn't say you cannot oppose abortion outside or pray. It doesn't say this. What it says is you cannot seek to influence people's behaviour or decision making, or seek to influence. And I think that's quite a careful wording, actually. And I think what that recognises is that women seeking abortion have made those decisions, or they may still be in a quandary. It may be their first consultation at a clinic. They're going to go away. They're still going to think about it. They may still change their mind. In the clinic itself, with staff that are qualified and who have thought about these things for a very long time, with multiple women, they will have counselling. Every woman having an abortion is entitled to counselling. So, and that counselling is not trying to push them towards an abortion. There is no abortion industry in Britain. This is a service that's provided to women because it's legal and because women want it and women need it. So I think that the influence wording is intentionally even-handed rather than vague. Now, I do understand what you say, that we don't want to have to stretch that criminalisation of it, the intention to influence, to other areas of life. I think this really has to be confined to these kinds of places or this kind of place, actually, because I think what you may be borrowing there, Lois, is the conversion therapy argument. So the argument against conversion therapy, proposed ban on conversion therapy, is that it would may possibly criminalise parents, therapists, doctors who seek to intervene upon a child or even an adult who is heading towards a very serious medical pathway towards transition. And I think it's not quite right to borrow that argument, because that's not that the concerns about conversion therapy are not space or place specific. I think there's something about seeking out these conversations in that place outside the clinic where the most you can claim is 15% of women might want to have that conversation. That means 85% of women going into clinics are having somebody there whose very presence is an interference, in the sense of a kind of an unwelcome disapproval, and a targeting. I don't think it goes as far as harassment very often. And I'm sure you're right on that. But nevertheless, this is something short of harassment, but nevertheless is targeted, because these women are exposed as who they are, which is women seeking an abortion, and I think we should really emphasize here, it is a lawful treatment. It's a lawful treatment which society moved towards, and that is taken up by thousands and thousands of women of all kinds, including mothers, well, largely mothers, all kinds of people. And yes, amongst that huge cohort of women will be people who are being coerced, and that's for the clinic staff to pick up on, and to intervene and do something about that. But I do think that we have to be really precise in understanding this, and not sort of be careful to represent it as it really is. Sorry, but just to quickly say that the intention originally, which was to stop these disruptive and potentially harassing protests outside clinics, would also have applied to counter protests by pro-abortion people, pro-choice people, which that was the threat of what was happening in America, which is you end up with this pantomime going on outside clinics, which is totally unacceptable, I think, in a civilized society.
Lois, I'm sure once again you've got plenty to say on that. Can I just ask, before you jump back into that though, Lois, because obviously this is one of the things that makes this conversation easier to digest, is this not a flat debate about whether abortion is right or wrong. And I think we're all thankful that that's not the debate we're currently having. This is about the distance outside abortion clinics at which people shouldn't be harassed. But one phrase that Jan has used a couple of times, reasonably so, is the question of conscience. And it seems like a reasonable thing to say that abortion is a question of conscience, and Christians don't have a monopoly on ethics or conscience. But for you to agree to that, Lois, as a Christian, would be for you to agree that moral relativism is true. And we don't agree with that, do we? So as Christians, we actually do believe that there is an undergirding moral truth beneath all of this. So how are we balancing that as Christians?
Well, I think it's only relevant to the extent of a kind of hypothetical conversation, because what's really happening, what Christians are doing outside of abortion facilities, is offering conversation. And that isn't to do with whether we are ultimately right now. Of course, I think we ultimately hold the truth that all women deserve better than abortion, that we can find solutions to support both lives and every pregnancy. Of course, I think that's true and right and just. But what is happening outside of abortion facilities is that conversations are being offered and prayers are being lifted. And those are two things that are not to do with debate, or not to do with a conflict. It's about being there to support women at the point of need. We know that this is helpful because women who have received that help have founded a campaign in honor of it. It's called Be Here For Me. And it's got hundreds of women who have spoken about turning up to an abortion facility, not really wanting to go through with an abortion, hoping that they would find another option. And there they were, and they found a volunteer. And today they're thriving as mothers. Their children are doing so well because they were able to make a different choice with support available to them because of pro-life volunteers. So we know that this is wanted and welcome. And on the converse, it was Jan raised that counselling is available inside abortion facilities. Now, that is technically true. However, the CQC, the Care Quality Commission, has reviewed hundreds of abortion facilities, and in various reports, they found in certain clinics that staff were encouraged to meet targets, that they felt that patients were being rushed through a system, rushed through a decision. And even patients spoke out, even staff spoke out about concerns that they had with the speed that a woman was often expected to make a decision within. So this is not a perfect system at all. And if a woman would like to have more time to sit and discuss with a volunteer from a different organisation that has more time to sit with them and to discuss other viable options that the clinic may not even know about, then that is her fundamental right to do so. And with buffer zones, we're not saying they're not pro-choice, they're no choice. They're taking away that choice from women to be able to have that discussion. We're assuming that she wants to go into the clinic, that she wants to go ahead with an abortion. And for many women, that's just not true. I think it was the BBC in 2022 found, I think it was close to 1 in 6 women who approach a clinic feel they're doing so under pressure, whether that's pressure from their economic situation, pressure from a partner who is trying to push them through to have an abortion that they're not ready for. And if that's the case, we need to be doing far better for women. And if pro-life volunteers want to give their time and resources to supporting women in that way at their place of need, then that's absolutely correct and right to do so. And it's appalling that this sweeping law is going to criminalize something that is good and helpful and right, all in the name because of this kind of Americanized idea, this image of angry maniac pro-life protesters, which I've never come across in Britain. And the majority of pro-life volunteers would condemn in any circumstance. And so it isn't right, isn't fair. It's much too far.
Jan, over to you.
Yeah, well, I think there's some confusion here, which is that you may well be right about the 1 in 6 figure. I think that sounds rather high, but nevertheless, say that's true. If that was true, and we've got a big problem with coercion being involved in women's reproductive choices, the solution to that is not the arbitrary application of a volunteer turning up outside of a clinic, is it? I mean, most clinics will not be covered by that kind of service provision if that's what these people claim they're doing, which it isn't what they're doing. That's just an arbitrary dropping in by a person with a particular viewpoint who just happens to be outside that clinic when one of the 1 in 6 women goes there. So that really isn't a solution if that's the problem. The solution would be to make sure that staff in clinics understand how to spot and deal with coercion, but also all of the kind of landscape of choice making that happens before people get anywhere near a clinic. This is the thing I think, again, is slightly disingenuous because, literally the final 5 minutes of somebody's walk into a clinic from a car park or up a road from a station is really not the place for these conversations to be taking place, if that's all they are, and maybe that's what they are. You've got the space as pro-life advocates to advocate all the way through the rest of people's lives. Whether that's, you go and do talks in schools, you can talk to people in universities, you can shape their decision-making landscape in advance of them ever having to face the dilemma. And then, of course, when people are actually pregnant and are facing the real dilemma, their views, the decision they make may not match their pre-existing views. As I'm sure many women who are very anti-abortion also seek abortions. Because it's something that people make for pragmatic reasons. It's not an ideology. It's not a belief. People don't believe in abortions as a good. I mean, I know there are some idiots who say this, but that I think that's not what normal people think, and that's not what people like me think. We think it's a necessity, which is not to say it's the only good solution to an unwanted pregnancy, but it's one of the solutions that women, in their numbers, show that it's necessary. So I do think that where there are problems, the solution is not the kind of arbitrary sprinkling of pro-life activists outside certain clinics. That really can't be a convincing solution to that kind of problem. It has to be something that's sorted out through the healthcare system, which is where these women are encountering the care that they are seeking.
I feel there is quite a convenience of saying that this is kind of sporadic and this isn't good enough, but surely the option then is to empower more pro-life support, to empower more organizations and charitable organizations in civil society to be doing more to support women to continue their pregnancies, as many would like to. And I think so civil society should play a far greater role, actually, broadly in Britain, in stepping in and helping and supporting women in crisis. But to say that they're kind of manipulating or using this excuse is really to ignore the incredible work that has happened and the testimonials of many women who've benefited from it. And I think those voices have been really lost in this debate. Typically, women who take advantage of this opportunity are poor. Quite often they are migrants. They don't have a platform. They don't often speak out to the press. I know quite a few of them, and they don't feel comfortable speaking to the press. They don't want to expose their stories. I understand that. But their voices are so often ignored or sidelined because I think the majority opinion or the majority kind of force in Britain is to say that pro-lifers are the bad guys and that abortion should just be accessed without any further interference from any pro-life opinions. But we have to look at the experience of those who have benefited from this. We have to look at the true incidences of people outside those clinics. And every case that has gone to court, be that Adam Smith, Connor, Livia Tadici-Bott, Isabel Van Spruce, they've all been committed charitable volunteers for many years, providing that support and doing the good work that so many of us should do. I wish we would do it across both sides of the aisle, pro-life or pro-choice. I wish we were all working towards better solutions to support single mothers in crisis, etc. But the reality is, at the moment, these are the guys that are doing it, and they deserve our support and not to be criminalised.
Well, I don't think that's quite right. I mean, I think I think what fails to come through all the time is a recognition of what these activities outside clinics mean to the other women, the majority of women who. So you can talk about the women who benefit, and I will just accept that there are women for whom there's been an intervention at that very point. I mean, lots of other women, I'm sure, find it much more helpful to have support prior to actually going to a clinic. That actually it happens because there's outreach work in the community, that the message is out there, that there are helplines, that there are services that are genuinely offering proper counselling or proper advice, medical care if necessary, to people, particularly the most vulnerable. But I don't think in the circumstances in which women are accessing clinics, there's a kind of hierarchy of vulnerability, actually, because I think as patients, they're also equally vulnerable in the sense that, if I were 3 years younger and found myself pregnant at a really crazy age of life, and it was making an incredibly difficult decision to then go to a clinic, I really, really would object, and I probably would actually object to somebody approaching me outside of a clinic as if they had any insight into the decision making I was going through. And I do think it's sort of, again, this is why I come down to this sort of idea of there could be a kind of ethical monopoly, because I think that those of a religious persuasion, obviously, they do feel like they're making judgments and decisions on a kind of different plane to those of us who are not religious. But I think it might be time to concede that that's not the case. And I don't think that necessarily gets us all the way to moral relativism, because I wouldn't say that I'm a moral relativist. But I do think there has been the problem with abortion as an issue is that really it serves as a kind of symbol. It's a sort of, it somehow became an issue. Don't fully understand why it did. It wasn't always an issue, and it was created into one at a certain point in the 20th century, because it came to symbolize to a lot of people of faith and others that society was going to hell in a handcart, and that somehow the number of abortions was a sign and a symptom of that. And if we could only arrest the number of abortions, we could somehow, arrest the degeneration of society as they saw it. And I think there's a problem there, because it's always women's behaviour that's seen as the measure of the society going to the dogs. And I think that the politicisation of abortion was a very, very good example of this, which is partly why I would always push back against it.
Well, it's time to take our second and final break of the episode. We're talking about freedom of speech, and we're engaging in freedom of speech, two people of differing views, but without any sniping or sneering. And I think due credit needs to be given to both Jan and Lois for the way that they're engaging in this conversation. It's quite uncommon, I think, when we're talking about things like abortion, to be able to hear two gentle voices on the matter. But we need to take a quick break. Hit the subscribe button or follow us on Apple Podcasts. If you want early access to shows, articles and extra content, head over to our website, premierunbelievable.com. We'll be back in just a moment for the final part of today's discussion on freedom of thought, freedom of religious expression, and buffer zones outside abortion clinics. Stay tuned.
We are launching a brand new course which helps us to consider the evidence and questions around the birth of Jesus. It's called Did It Really Happen? The Birth of Jesus. Why not sign up for the course or gift it to a friend? Find out more at premierunbelievable.com.
Welcome back to Unbelievable and part 3 of today's debate about freedom of speech, buffer zones and silent prayer. Is the law clear enough? How can we learn to live together? We want women to be able to access good and safe healthcare for sure. Welcome back to my guests for the final part, Lois Miller-McClatchy and Jan McVarish. Lois, let's pick straight up off what we were talking about in part 2. Let me ask you this rather blunt question. Should pro-life people be arrested for their thoughts?
Not only should pro-life people not be arrested for their thoughts, but nobody should be arrested for their thoughts across the board. That's just not a standard that Britain should ever be upholding, whether this is 1984 or 2024. That's just never acceptable. I'll pick up a little bit on the last comment that Jan made about kind of why we got to this place where we have this abortion argument. And I think there's a lot of misconception, especially in the media, when this is, and people seem to think we're just kind of out to get women, out to punish women for what they've done, and nothing could be further from the truth. There's 2 key reasons why people are pro-life. Firstly is if the child is a human, which scientifically we've seen that all babies are human, and if humans have rights, which we know they do from the law, then we have an obligation to protect the right to life of every baby, whether they are born in a situation of choice or by chance, whether they are black, white, male, female, have a disability, anything else. We have an obligation to protect their right to life. And secondly, because we want to support women who we feel are often at the bad end of a deal when it comes to abortion. When abortion came in, it said, my body, my choice. Unfortunately, that meant a lot of men say, your body, your choice, your issue, and abandon women to a pregnancy that was often meant to be the responsibility of 2. And we think abortion has generally been harmful to women's mental and physical health, and that women deserve far better. So those are the 2 key reasons why people are motivated to be pro-life. And that's the motivation that many volunteers have as they stand near a clinic offering charitable help, holding a leaflet, or even simply just thinking and praying inside their head. It's not an unlawful thought. Maybe people disagree with them, but it's not an unlawful thought. There are no unlawful thoughts. Now, the ridiculous nature of this thought crime that's been introduced is that if they were standing there thinking about murdering someone, if they were standing there thinking about robbing a bank, if they were thinking about heinous crimes, that would be perfectly legal. But because they are thinking about abortion, that can be a crime. That cannot be right. That cannot be in line with international human rights law or basic common sense in the UK. Or say they're walking through a buffer zone, as many of these are, public spaces where people frequent on commutes, etc. Say they're thinking or praying about their family, their work, and for a moment they think to pray about abortion, and then they think about something else. That means that for those few seconds that they were in the buffer zone, they were committing a crime, but whilst they were praying about other things, they weren't. That can't be right either. None of this makes sense. It's absolutely ludicrous that we're even going into the details of someone's prayer or someone's thoughts. The fact that they could be standing there protesting loudly about climate change or wars in the Middle East, but they cannot think silently about abortion just shows the ridiculousness of this thought crime. And whether we agree with pro-lifers or not, this has got to be a standard that we hold for everybody, that nobody should be arrested for their thoughts.
We'll come to you, Jan, because we are in 2024, and it does seem at times when we're talking about stuff like this that we're back in 1984 by George Orwell. So how would you respond to what Lois has said specifically on the idea of thought crimes being committed?
Yeah, well, I think it's legitimate for us all to be concerned about the criminalisation of thought. And I think there are instances around this issue where that happens. And I do think, a sort of hypersensitivity about people who think that abortion is a sin, presumably that's part of the package of pro-life views, which that's up to people. If that's the judgment they make on somebody's decision to have an abortion, is that they have sinned or about to sin, I think that's fine. Obviously, and I think we have to accept in every other area of life that we might get condemned by that if we are by those people, and that's part of living in a diverse society. Is the one that is tolerant. Is we have to tolerate the fact that other people judge us. Now, I think that's fine. I mean, I don't think in a workplace that might be appropriate all the time for the person who's pro-life to be pinning pictures on the board and saying, oh yes, who's had an abortion and I judge you, you're a sinner. I think there will be lots of places where it's not judged to be appropriate because it's, it's such a personal area of life. But nevertheless, I don't think in the buffer zone example, that's what's going on. So I think the only reason why the people standing outside the clinics are asked if they're praying is to try and determine the purpose of their visit. Now, if I were to repeatedly visit a buffer zone, and I was also maybe a known protester, and the police turned up because the staff called them, or the police were patrolling, I don't know how it happens, or maybe people who live nearby have recognised one of these individuals. The police are obviously going to say, what's the purpose of your presence here, or something similar, because they're trying to determine who should be able to stand in a buffer zone and who can't stand in a buffer zone. Now, obviously, that sounds really petty and technical and awful, but I don't know how else you can get around that, really, so that's why they ask about what's going on. And of course, this is staged. These are staged. It's not somebody happening to walk through a buffer zone. That's just not what's happened. These are repeated visits. And they're also, those people have chosen that location. That's a choice that they have made. It's not that they've stumbled across it or there's some kind of deep emotional attachment to that particular location, that was the place where my child was aborted years ago. That may be the case, but these are people I don't think that's generally what's happened. And I think if somebody did that once or, number of times, that might be the case. But I think that this prayer thing is a real red herring, false flag, whatever you call it. Red herring, I think is probably the word, because it allows the pro-life argument to move on to this territory of thought crime. And I generally don't think that's what's going on. This is not the policing of thought, it's the policing of actions. And the action is putting yourself in a buffer zone outside an abortion clinic. You can pray anywhere. This is why I think there's a slight degradation of the idea of prayer going on. Because presumably with prayer, it doesn't matter where your feet are. What it matters is where your head is. So the reason why your feet are within 150 metres of an abortion clinic is because you want to somehow be seen by human beings, not by God. It's about being seen and having an impact on women going into clinics. That's the purpose of being there at those times. Now, I know sometimes they do it when clinics are closed. I would argue that's also tactical, so that they can say, well, we've also been policed when the clinic's closed. And when I say that it's tactical, I don't mean that people are cynical about the issue itself, abortion. I don't think that's what motivates. I don't think people, what would you be cynical about? You just disagree with it. But in intending to influence and impose yourself in some way upon women at the most kind of crucial point, where they're walking through a door, when they're approaching a clinic, they've never been there before, they're accessing unpleasant treatment. Unpleasant treatment. They're going to be exposed in the way that, any women who go through gynecological procedures, you don't want to be encountering a flipping conversation just before that point. It's a very private moment and quite disturbing for a lot of people, and really disturbing for a lot of people because of the nature of the decisions. These could be people who, they're making a decision about a child that's been found to be very seriously ill within them, or disabled, or potentially with a terrible prognosis. And they won't be having the abortion there. They'll have to go somewhere else, to a hospital, if that's the case. But nevertheless, I do think there's a lack of humanity, which is quite odd for Christians, I think. And it's obviously not all Christians. Loads of Christians say, I'm pro-life, but I would not do this. So I think there's a need to kind of address those distinctions as well. But I just think it comes down all the time to there. Why there? Why pray there?
That does seem, Lois, to be a decent challenge from Jan. God obviously is everywhere, and so we can pray anywhere and know that we have had our prayers heard. So is it just tactical? Is Jan right? Is it simply being in that location a tactic to move the conversation, move the goalposts? What do you think about that?
No, of course not. So there's two key reasons, I think, why people choose to pray specifically near an abortion facility. One is because a presence does matter when you are praying. There's a reason why if somebody dies in a road accident, they might leave flowers near the side of the road, mark the spot. If somebody dies on a hill, you might find people going to pray near there. Catholics like to go and pray near a graveside sometimes to remember those that they've lost. There's many reasons why people go to a specific location to think and reflect on a specific issue. And to pray for those who were there at the clinic that day, inobtrusively, unbeknownst. That's also a reason to be praying there. So I think that's specifically for Christians, that's a real reason why they want to be close to a clinic. But also, it isn't illegal to be there, because mere presence is not illegal. And to say that the government can define areas where certain thoughts are banned, it's horrific. I think we have to look at it from that perspective. Like, why is the government saying that we cannot be in this space? It's on them to prove that that's an issue, and it's not an issue if people are behaving the law and really thinking thoughts. And now I'll come back to another thing that Jan said was that this is to kind of open the door and move the conversation on to the next thing, which is, why are they standing there? Well, standing there, that's just mere presence. So whether they're thinking silently or not, or thinking about their lunch, mere presence on the street is not a crime. Mere presence cannot be counted as being harassment or engaging in any activity. It's just standing there. I think we have to really focus in on what's being made illegal here. Standing, thinking. When Adam Smith Connor, the military veteran and father of two who has been in court recently for his silent prayers, was asked by the police, they approached him and said, what are you doing? He said, I'm praying. And they said, what is the nature of your prayer? He said, I'm praying about my son. And they said, well, I'm sorry to hear that, but we'll have to enforce the rules of the PSPO, which mentions prayer. And so they knew that how ridiculous this conversation was sounding, that he was praying about his son, and yet they still had to consult this piece of legislation which was going to force him to move. It's outrageous that police are being put in this situation. It's outrageous that these conversations are happening over people who are simply standing, simply thinking. And I think it's an oversight of the free speech movement that we're not defending these people more. I think it's so easy to defend those that we agree with, and quite often we find ourselves agreeing with gender critical feminists and others, and the free speech movement is so good at defending those. But when it comes to the A word, it's tricky because so many free speech advocates disagree with it. And therefore, I think that these problems are being overlooked, and the freedom to just think silently on a street is being lost because these people are not really popular enough.
So Lois, if pro-choice advocates decided to individually or in small groups start to congregate outside clinics and cheerlead for abortion, and to sort of whoop it up, go girl, you go and you make sure you steer towards the abortion rather than the non-abortion or the keeping the baby, are they morally right because they're, is that just a thought crime? I mean, okay, so say they did it silently, but nevertheless they had a sign that said, come and talk to me. I mean, is that really what you want to be happening outside clinics? I mean, I think it's a really bad look for the pro-life movement, actually, to sort of be engaging in activities in this place. And again, I can't stress it enough. It's this place. It's an undignified thing for your side, I think. And it's also because it robs the dignity of women who are trying to access something that is legal, that has been argued for, that continually comes up in the House of Commons as something for debate. And now I accept that, we don't have total freedom to debate it, and it should be much more free. But that's another issue. It's presence plus intent that's trying to be assessed here when the police are asking these questions that do sound daft. I accept that, and I wouldn't necessarily want a heavy-handed response to it and all of that. But nevertheless, I think the activists are the ones that are pushing the kind of the argument all the time here, because they're trying to turn it into a free speech issue.
Let me answer the question. You asked me, do I think it's morally wrong for a pro-abortion activist to cheerlead outside clinics? I think it's morally wrong. I do not think it's criminal. And that is the key here. And you can think that pro-life advocates are morally wrong if you want. You have the complete right to make that decision, to think that they are wrong. But what they are doing is not criminal. And that's the key of the question. It is not criminal to think. It's not criminal to have a consensual conversation. And if they are staying within the boundaries of the law, then they should be allowed to be there.
But the boundaries of the law are not where you say they are they? Because the boundaries of the law have been drawn as existing 150 metres from the clinic. That's
not
the
to
point.
ban presence. So the law does not ban presence. The law bans influence. And as you pointed out earlier, that does not specify prayer, and certainly not silent prayer. And yet
but that's why they're doing it, isn't it? That's why they're silently praying, is to object to they object to buffer zones, because as you said, you think that it would be okay for pro-choice people to cheerlead outside the clinic. I don't. I think that's wrong. And if that were to be the thing that was going to be happening, which looked like it might do actually, as a counter protest to the very aggressive protest by the pro-lifers, that's where buffer zones started. Let's not forget. I think that kind of pantomime outside the clinic would be abhorrent, and I think you should be worried about that prospect as well. And it's not that I don't think that people who are pro-life are morally wrong, but I do think that when those pro-lifers choose to do that outside clinics, they're making a bad moral choice. I think it's something that disregards the majority of women who go into those clinics.
And you're within your rights to think that they're making a bad choice. And I think that those who would go and cheerlead and cause disruption for the pro-choice movement would be making a bad choice too. But this cannot be the boundary of the law. We don't define the law. And so now we see that the word influence is so big that it is going to be interpreted to cover these legal things. And that cannot be right, because freedom of thought is protected in international human rights law by the European Convention on Human Rights, as is freedom of speech. And so if the law is going to be expanded to cover those things which have been already prosecuted in local areas, then we have a big, big problem with the conflation between this particular piece of legislation and human rights as a whole. That's going to cause immense legal challenges. Law has to be precise. It has to be understood by the people who are being governed by it, so that we know if we are committing a crime or not. But these people are being told, well, it's a human right to be able to think freely, and yet this could or may be one day interpreted to be under the bounds of influence. That leads to chaos and confusion. We cannot have that in a British legal system. It has to be clear. It has to be precise. People have to know what they're doing. And a British legal system can never truly make free thought illegal. And therefore, what we need is clarity. We need guidance from the government, from the policing commission, from various bodies who are going to be involved in enforcing buffer zones, to say, influence does not extend to simple presence in a buffer zone, to simple thought in a buffer zone, or to consensual conversation between two parties, because those things are obviously protected in international human rights law. And I will accept a buffer zone that says that harassment is illegal. Of course, it's not necessary, because harassment is already illegal, as we know. But what it can't do is make good, peaceful, and lawful activities somehow under question, somehow make people fear for their safety and security if they're going to be engaging in lawful activity. And that's the situation we have right now, and it's wrong. Freedom of thought is never illegal. Thoughts are not crimes.
We've got just a few minutes left for some closing comments, so we'll give you the chance to sum up on your side, Jan. Particularly, what's the way forward from here? How does the future look from your perspective on this issue?
Well, ideally, we would never have got here, because ideally, pro-life people would have called off the kinds of activities that prompted buffer zones. Ideally, the pro-life camp would have taken a reasonable and a political path. So they would have dealt with their pro-life views either at an individual level and said, it's not for me. And that's quite right. I mean, absolutely. I want everybody to make a decision about their own abortion. Or non-abortion, pregnancy, having babies, for themselves. I think that's my line. But what I think where we've got lost is that the pro-life movement actually ceased to be a moral movement. It became a political movement. And when it did that, it adopted the tactics of political activists. And although they've now kind of morphed again into silent prayer, I think that is, I have to say, I don't really trust it. I kind of think it's a tactic which has come about because the more militant kind of pro-life activists were sort of, I kind of lost the argument, because I think most people thought that the kinds of activities of showing hideous pictures outside of clinics, of singing hymns in very large numbers was just unacceptable. And I think most British people do not agree with that. And I think by losing that argument, they've then got another route, which is to go back to what was originally happening, which was these kind of individuals, standing with rosary beads or whatever outside clinics, which were tolerated for years. So I think then they've tried to sort of say, well, actually, this is all about thought crime. And I do think that there are dangers of massive overreach of the policing of public spaces. So, in my day job, the Free Speech Union, we've taken cases against various local councils who've tried to impose public space protection orders in city centres, for example. One of them recently was about people who weren't allowed to say anything pejorative. I mean, I absolutely think that would be a policing of speech and policing of thought, which is totally unacceptable. But that's in a general public space. It's the specificity of this highly sensitive area of life, which is abortion clinics and possibly other clinics. I don't know. It may arise if activists decide to go that route. I mean, why not go to fertility clinics where there's embryos, most of which will not be implanted and become babies? Will pro-life people start protesting outside or silent praying outside fertility clinics? Then we'd have to consider that,
Lois, just 60 seconds for you to give some closing remarks.
Sure. Well, the 3 individuals that have gone to court already for their presence in a buffer zone were all engaging simply in thought. And it's not for me or Jan or the government or anyone else to determine their intentions behind those thoughts or what they were thinking, because they were there to silently pray. And that's the activity they were engaging in. And for us to tell them, no, you were protesting, no, you were behaving badly, no, you were seeking to influence, it's simply not on us and it's not on the government. The government does not have the right to monitor people's peaceful thoughts or to tell women that they cannot have a conversation that they want to have. This is a very serious topic that has implications for other areas outside of abortion as well. And nobody should be criminalized for their thoughts, for their speech, for conversations that they're having in any area of life either. So definitely one to think about as it rolls out on the 31st of October, and to keep an eye out for those who may face difficulties because of these peaceful and lawful activities.
Well, thank you, both of you. We're going to have to leave it there. And of course, it is a tough debate and neither side here have convinced the other. But what do you think? Why don't you let us know? Email us, unbelievable@premier.org.uk. But it has been a very substantive debate on a very sensitive topic, but hopefully we've dealt with it sensitively. Huge thanks and kudos to both my guests, Jan McVarish and Lois Miller-McClatchy, who have exhibited a really gentle and humble approach, even-handed, non-antagonistic, no name-calling in sight. So in your comments and thinking about this debate, please do model what you've seen today. Huge thanks to both of you. And from me, Andy Kind, and everybody here at Unbelievable, we thank you for watching. And obviously we'll be back in the future with lots more debates and discussions around the topics that matter to everybody. For now, take care and goodbye.